they want. I don't give a fuck. All right, here we go. In 1920 and again in 1921, Lenin had indicated disappointment in the direction of the organizational priorities established by the American Communist Party. He suggested further that black people should play a critical role in the party and in the vanguard of the workers' movement, since black people occupied the most oppressive sectors of the American society and were clearly to be expected to be the most angry element in the United States. All of this was somewhat characteristic of Lenin as he rationalized the basic opportunism that had dominated the history of the Bolshevik movement. Hold on a second. However, Lenin had found no basis of support for his declaration within the American delegation of the Second Congress. Indeed, in the person of the Harvard-trained revolutionary writer, John Reed, the American delegation, preoccupied with the image of UNIA, repudiated Lenin's position. Reed defined the American black problem as, quote, that of a strong racial and social movement, and of the proletarian labor movement advancing very fast in class consciousness. He alluded to the Garvey movement in terms that ruled out all black nationalism and separatism. Quote, the black people have no demands for national independency. All movements aimed at a separate national existence from black people fail, as did the Black Back to African movement, quote unquote, of a few years ago. They consider themselves, first of all, Americans at home in the United States. This makes it very much simpler for the communist. For the time being, the Comintern was satisfied by the vague plan to invite black revolutionists to the future Congress. To such figures such as the Fourth Congress of the Communist International of 1922, Otto Hueswood would as an official delegate, and Claudia McKay as an unofficial and non-communist observer. McKay and Housewood, quote, the biracial delegate, end quotes, as McKay would refer to him in his autobiography, A Long Way from Home, tended to complement each other in both official and informal discussions of the black question. When the American black delegate was invited to attend meetings and my biracial colleague went, the people asked, quote, but where is the the black people? The biracial delegate said, say, fellow, you're all right for propaganda. It is pity you'll never make any disciplined party member. Oh, that's disgusting. Why don't you say that to them? And with the there's my first visual thing. Hello. All right, here we go. Okay, cool. And with the aid of the Japanese revolutionary, signed Kiyantamiya, can't say it, who had spent some time in the United States working as a cook and other things on the West and East Coast, had been a founder of a unified and Bolshevized American Party, and now sat on the commissions. McKay and Housewood successfully presented to the Comintern session a more realistic basis for discussion. And it was at the Fourth Congress that the Comintern made its first formal declaration of policy towards American black people. Early the following year, Rose Pastor Stokes, the radical wife of J.C. Phelps Stokes, one of the NAACP's millionaire sponsors, returned to the United States and reported to her fellow party members. I gotta do something, hold on a second. It's like, I have like a little like thing on my glasses and it's like making my eyes go to it. Sorry, everybody. Yeah. One of the most significant developments of the Fourth Congress of the Communist International was the creation of a Black Commission and the adoption of the Commission's thesis of the Black question, which concludes with the declaration that, quote, the Fourth Congress recognizes the necessity of supporting every form of Black movement which tends to undermine capitalism and imperialism or to impede their further progress. Pledges the Communist International to fight, quote, for race equality of the Black person with the white people, for equal wages, political and social rights, end quote, to, quote, exert every effort to admit Black people into trade unions, end quote, and to, quote, take immediate steps to hold a general Black conference or Congress in Moscow. Two Black Americans were guests of the Congress, one a poet, the other a speaker and organizer, both young and energetic, devoted to the cause of Black liberation and responsive to the deals of the revolutionary proletariat. They charmed the delegates with their fine personalities. According to Miss Stokes, or is it Mr.? It's Miss Stokes, yeah. The Black Commission itself was international in its membership, made up the delegates from the United States, Belgium, France, England, Java, British South Africa, Japan, Holland, and Russia. The perspectives of the Commission was thus international, reflecting the internationalism of Marxist organization, the theory of capitalism, and its membership. As the chairman of the Commission, Comrade Sasha Stokes, had announced, the world Black movement must be organized in America as the center of Black culture and the crystallization of Black protest. In Africa, the reservoir of human labor for the further development of capitalism. In Central America, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Colombia, Nicaragua, and other independent republics, where American imperialism dominates. In Puerto Rico, Haiti, San Domingo, and other islands washed by the waters of the Caribbean, in South Africa and the Congo, in East Africa. The work among black people in America then was to be one sector in the world movement against colonialism and imperialism as the contemporary stages of world capitalism. The Communist International was to be the vehicle through which the enslaved white workers of Europe and America and the revolutionary workers and peasants of the whole world who would coverage on the common enemy. It is the task of the Communist International to point out to Black people that they are not the only people suffering from oppression of capitalism and imperialism, that the workers and peasants of Europe and Asia and of Americas are also the victims of imperialism, that the struggle against imperialism is not the struggle of any one people, but of all the peoples of the world, that in China and India, in Persia and Turkey, in Egypt and Morocco, the oppressed people of color, colonial peoples, are raising against the same evil that Black people are raising against racial oppression and discrimination and intensified industrial exploitation, that these peoples are starving for the same ends, that Black people are starving for political, industrial, and social liberation and equality. Notwithstanding its contradictions and ideological formulations, these theses on the Black question was quite remarkable. Certainly, its new world centric view limited it. For example, the proposition that the, quote, center of Black culture and protest was in America. Certainly the presumption that the proletarianized Black people in America was the most advanced sector of the Black world was more a vulgarization of Marx than a product of analysis. Marxism, not Marx himself. But just as certain, this statement was more sophisticated presentation of the world system than had been developed in the earlier internationalism of the UNIA. The Commission had successfully urged the Fourth Congress to recognize the relationship between black people, the black question, and the colonial question. The intention behind the Black Commission of the Fourth Congress was to substitute system and class consciousness for race consciousness among black American black people. Yet, one enduring lesson learned from the UNIA was that black people were capable of organizing on an international scale. That Black Commission suggested that the UNIA's was only a particular form of race consciousness, possible for race consciousness to be transformed into a progressive force. A world historical race consciousness, recognizing the exploitation of black people as black, but as part of and related to the exploitation of other workers, could develop from the earlier form. The historical problem poses before the Comintern and its member parties, and especially for American communism, was whether the communist movement had the capabilities to perform this transformation, starting with the efforts of Huweswan, McKay, and Katayami. It would become increasingly clear to the leadership of the Comintern, Reddick, Zinoviev, Trotsky, Lenin, and later Stalin, that only the special program could attract large numbers of black workers to the movement. After 1922, the toolage and training of black cadres in the Soviet Union was taken quite seriously. The most critical of the results was the formulation of the nation within a nation thesis announced by the Sixth Congress of 1928. So it sounds like they're taking these into considerations and actually formulating an analysis. These are the Comintern. These are Marxists. What the fuck?
We're about to talk about my favorite black communist that I read all about.
Harry Hayward was one of the African black people brought to the Soviet Union to study at the University of Toiler of the East, CUTVA. When we arrived in April 1926, he joined a small colony of black students that included his brother Otto Hall, Aunt John Jones, O.J. and Jane Golden, Harold Williams, Dessalines, Roy O'Mahony, Jim Farmer, Madhu White, who arrived in December 1927, and Bekulo, a Gold Coast inhabitant. Of the 7 black students at KUTVA and black people who arrived in the Soviet Union as delegates of the Sixth Congress in 1928, Haywood alone advocated the position of self-determination for American black people. Haywood's own conversation had come in the winter of 1928, when the preparation for the Congress, he had responded to a dismissive report on the UNIA authored by his brother Otto. In a discussion, I point out that Otto's position was not merely a rejection of Garveyism, but also a denial of nationalism as a legitimate trend in black freedom movement. I felt that it amounted to throwing out the baby with the bathwater. With my insight sharped by previous discussions, I argued further that the nationalism reflected in the Garvey movement was not a foreign transplant, nor did it sprung full-blown from the brow of Jove. On the contrary, it was an indigenous product arising from the soil of black super-exploitation and oppression of the United States. It expressed the yearning of millions of black people for a nation of their own. As I pursue this logic, a totally new thought occurred to me, and for me, it was the slincher. The Garvey movement is dead, I reasoned, but not black nationalism. Nationalism, which Garvey diverted under the slogan of Back to Africa, was an authentic trend, likely to flare up again in periods of crisis and stress. Such a movement might again fall under the leadership of utopian visionaries, who should seek to divert it from the struggle against the main enemy, U.S. imperialism, and on a reactionary separatist path. The only way such a diversion of the struggle could be forestalled was I was the first American communist, with perhaps the exception of Briggs, to support the thesis that U.S. black people constituted an oppressed nation. In Novovo, Bob Koltz, a Russian representative of the Young Communist League, having spent some time in the United States, was already convinced that American black people constituted a national question. Katayami was as well, and suggested to Haywood that Lenin had supported the idea, but they and similarly minded Soviet communists had found it difficult in locating any American black people to support their position. Nov heard Haywood's arguments and promptly requested his collaboration. From the moment Haywood voiced his commitment to black nationalism, the moment was momentum was established for the self-determination line that would become the Comintern's official policy after the Congress. The resolution and discussion papers drafted by Haywood and Nazanova eventually culminated in the language on the American Black Question, including in the Congress report, thesis on the revolutionary movement in the colonies and semi-colonies, end quote, 12th December, 1928. In those regions of the South in which compact black masses are living, it is essential to put forward a slogan of the right of self-determination for black people. A radical transformation of an agrarian structure of the southern states is one of the basic tasks of the revolution. Black communists must explain to non-black workers and peasants that only their close union with white proletariat and joint struggle with them against the American bourgeoisie can lead to their liberation from barbarous exploitation, and that only the victorious proletariat revolution will completely and permanently solve the agrarian national question of the southern United States in the interests of the overwhelming majority of the black population of the country. Black self-determination was presented to the American Communist Party as a fait accompli. Fiat accompli. And for years, the true origins of the line would be a mystery to members of a American Communist movement, as well as to its historians. Its meaning, however, was clear, as Joseph Poigney John Pepper characterized it, or as Haywood argues, charactered it. In the lines first American exposure, the logic of self-determination would conclude in a Black Soviet Republic. As a strategy, Black self-determination addressed itself to several concerns within the Comintern and the American movement. First of all, by the procedure through which it was established, it underlined the leadership of the Comintern over its national parties. Moreover, legitimate by the existence of our national liberation movement was, as well as the earlier history of American black people. It also relieved somewhat the disappointment of some Third Internationalists caused by the failure of an immediate immediate world revolution to develop. National liberation struggles were, by their nature, protracted ones. As a political model, it was also useful as a means of expression for those nationalism and chauvinism of longer duration in the American Communist Party. Many ideologues in the American movement identified their own nationalist sensibilities with black nationalism. Finally, it was believed it was the most effective means of approaching one of the oldest American peoples, the black person, first through its radical nationalist intelligentsia masses. Not only should self-determination attract black people, it was argued, but it could also be the litmus for determining the degree of progressiveness among non-black party militants, while weakening the ruling class by jarring the Bourbon pseudo-aristocracy from its industrial and financial sponsors. Still, the theoretical basis for the party's identification of black people as a nation was quite unorthodox in terms of Marxist theory, because we believe in internationalism. Marx and Engels had both distinguished both nations and nationalities, recognizing in the former the capacity for independent economic existence, and in the later a incapacity. Engels had expressed himself quite clearly. Oh yeah, it was approved. Now you're just going to give me another one. There is no country in Europe where there are not different nationalities under the same government. Here, then, we perceive the differences between the principle of nationalities and the old democratic and working class tenet as a right of the great European nations to separate and independent existence. The principle of nationalities, quote unquote, leaves entirely untouched a great question of the right of national existence for the historic peoples of Europe. Nay, if it touches, it is merely disrupt it. Sorry. The principle of nationalities raises two sorts of question. First of all, question of boundary between these great historic peoples, and secondly, questions as to the right to independent national existence of those numerous small relics of peoples which, after having figured for a longer and shorter period on the stage of history, were finally absorbed as integral portions into one or the other of those more powerful nations whose greater vitality, is that right?
It's vitality.
Yeah, enabled them to overcome great obstacles. The logical extension from Marx and Engels would have been to identify the black people of America as a national minority or as a nationality, but not as a nation. For Marx and Engels, the nation was a quite particular historical phenomenon. Since the end of the Middle Ages, history has been moving towards a European made up of large national states. Only such national states constitute the normal political framework for the dominant European bourgeois class, and in addition, they are the indispensable prerequisites without which the rule of the proletariat cannot exist. Engels' historicism, which is another word for historical materialism, this is the critique I have, because historical materialism is a thing and it's been shown to be a thing. It's science. Because it's Engels' historical materialism, not his historicism, branded the nation as an instrument of the bourgeoisie. His emergency was concomitant to the development of a bourgeois society, a capitalist society. And once nation, and then the transnational realized it was possible for the international revolution movement to command the society that had produced it. For Marx, both language and culture appear to be the secondary phenomenon, and first to be associated with nationality, and the second with the dominant classes. Unfortunately, throughout the 19th century and into the next, Much of the theoretical grammar brought by Marx and Engels, Lenin, and other Marxists to the analysis of American phenomena and the processes was similar naive, maybe to some degree, but not to all degrees. It was naive because of its ahistoricy and its tendency towards the use of aggregative concepts to the point of superfluousness. Ultimately, its naivety was contradictory. At the historical point of mass immigration, the application of race and class, the grammar's two most fundamental categories, presumed the existence among the majority of American workers of a white working class, which eventually appearance of a black nation suggested an opposite historical monumentum. This guy's funny. Lenin proved to be the theoretical and ideological midwife, but it was Stalin that came to be believed in the American Communist Party and by its historians, who had provided the theoretical basis for the party's position that black people were a nation within a nation. If there was a genius in the schema, Theodore Draper would declare, quote, "It was undoubtedly Stalin." However, the contrast between Stalin and Engels and Marx was dramatic. In what was to be one of the most frequently cited justifications for the Comintern black program, quote unquote, Stalin had entirely forsaken analytical sophistication. The nation is a historically established, stable community of people coming into existence on the basis of a community of language, territory, economic life, and psychological constitution, which manifest themselves in a community of culture. This extraordinary passage is perhaps characteristic of Stalin's theoretical contribution to Marxist thought and to the world knowledge. First, it too is ahistoric, since no contemporary nation has emerged in this way. Second, it is abstract and vague, utilizing such phrases as psychological constitution. Third, it is tautological. Community manifests itself as community. And finally, it is not a Marxian trend as it does towards an evolutionary paradigm as opposed to the historical materialism. It is one opposite feature was that it was in keeping with the ideological and pragmatic opportunism that characterizes Stalin's immediate predecessor. The policy implication of this passage fit quite well into the rationalization found in left-wing communism. That is perhaps another sort of proof that the policy was a gloss on the history of black movements and not the independent product of the Soviet Union political elite. Political elite. Like formulation on other national liberation struggles, one discovers in the Comintern Declaration searching for a theoretical justification. I don't think so. I don't know if I think they tried. It thus represented a crucial importance to the Soviet Party of forming alliances with movements that were emerging from theoretical pre-capitalist societies. Given historical necessity, Marxist-Leninism comprised itself theoretically with nationalism and as such institutionalized the force that had brought the Second International to its submission. It might be said that in that most simple-minded reading of the dialectic, that the Third International was a synthesis of the thesis socialism and the antithesis national chauvinism of the second. As official policy, American Communist Party self-determination, the Black Belt thesis would survive Stalin but only barely. Wasn't the black belt thesis brought to you by Harry Haywood, who was a Marxist? I thought that's the black belt thesis that Harry Haywood was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he's a Marxist, isn't he not?
Yeah.
Oh, weird. Even while Stalin was dominant figure in the world communist movement, would have its ups and downs, responding to the national and international dynamics of the revolutionary movement. The policy of black self-determination was lived twice and died twice. After overthrowing Lovestone's revisionism, Broder made self-determination one of the cardinal articles of faith of his leadership in November 1943, long after it had ceased to show any signs of life. He delivered the funeral oration over the corpse of self-determination. He explained that black people had already exercised the historical right of self-determination by rejecting it. After overthrowing Broder's revisionism, Foster made self-determination one of the cardinal articles of faith of his leadership. And in 1947, self-determination was reincarnated in a slightly watered-down version as the pragmatic demand and not as a immediate slogan of action. In 1958, the communist leadership had buried the corpse of the right of self-determination and decided that the American black people were no longer a stable community, that the black national question was no longer essentially a peasant question, that black people did not possess any distinctively, quote, common psychological makeup. At the main current of black people thought and leadership, quote, historically and universally at the present time, followed towards equality with other Americans, that the American black people did not constitute a nation, and therefore that the right of self-determination did not apply to them. Lenin was compelled, the American Communist Party, to take the black American as a critical element in its policies and organization. Stalin himself, a member of the Russian national minority, had been the authority through which the Comintern and the American Communist Party had come to recognize black people as an oppressed nation. And for a while, the policies directly influenced by these two Bolsheviks had been successful. Thousands of black people came into the CPUSA during the 1930s in response to the party's attention and express intentions. However, in the background, were the UNIA and the Brotherhood. They had established the political and ideological preconditions for the party's policies and its successes. It was the UNIA that had embodied the black radical tradition, primed the black masses with a sense of nationhood. It was the UNIA and the ABB through which many of the early black activists in the party had passed. And it was the UNIA and the Brotherhood that had demonstrated the capacity of black people to organize politically and respond ideologically. It remains a telling point on the nature of the early American communist movement that the significance of these examples had to depend upon Soviet direct policies to be revealed. That's because they're part of a whole thing. That's the whole point of the party, is to come up with these questions and come up with an analysis so that you can engage with its dialect. Anyways, in the light to this account, the Russian and Comintern intervention into the affairs of the American Communist Party, it would appear to be a historical irony that it was through Du Bois' work that a first reassessment of Marxian revolutionary theory was attempted. It was Du Bois who introduced into American Marxists a critical interpretation of the nature and significance of revolution, based in large measures on the developments of Russian Revolution and American Reconstruction period. Du Bois was a Marxist, everybody. Just want to let everybody know that. Du Bois, in Radical Theory, as black, Du Bois was sensitive to the contradictions in American society, in particular to the material force of racism. He was ever more conscious of racism since in his earlier years he had been cocooned from it. Okay, it's not what I thought. Okay, cocooned, meaning, okay. He was a young man by the time he was forced to openly confront the culture of racism. Later, as a black scholar, he had an immediate and profound experience with the false histories produced in that culture. Both his training at Harvard with his history department largely influenced by German historiography and his studies in Berlin had left him with an acute sensitivity for myth and propaganda in history. And as we have suggested earlier, as a critic of Marx, Du Bois had possessed no obligation to Marxist or Leninist dogma. What? Nor to the vagaries of historical analysis and interpretations of characterized American communists throughout. Given these attributes enveloped by the events of the post-war World War I period, Du Bois obtained the skills to seize the advantage created by this crisis of capitalism. Somebody in each era must make clear the fact with utter disregard to his own wishes and desire and belief. What we have got to know so far as possible are the things that actually happen in the world. The historian has no right posing as scientists to conceal and distort facts. And until we distinguish between these two functions of the chronicler of human action, we are going to render it easy for the muddled world, out of sheer ignorance, to make the same mistakes 10 times over. It's not, history is a, never mind. He had written these words. What's up?
I was just going to say, they're trying to make Du Bois look like he's not even a Marxist. So,
yeah.
I mean, take these words with a grain of salt, everybody.
Yeah. He had, and that's probably right, read Black Reconstruction, I think. We had written these words in American historiographies in mind, but we may also assume he had an additional application at hand. Among the several truths that Du Bois set out to establish in Black Reconstruction, there were a number that related directly to Marxist and Leninist theory, specifically his ideas concerning the emergence of capitalism, the nature of revolutionary consciousness, and the nature of revolutionary organization. As we recall, first Du Bois would insist on the world historical significance of American slavery, the emergence of modern capitalism and imperialism. In this, he went no further than Marx, but this is merely where he began, because next, he would demonstrate historically the revolutionary force of slave and peasant laborers. This in opposition to the reactionary industrial working class. Finally, question the presumed roles of a vanguard and the masses in the development of revolutionary consciousness and effective revolutionary action. With regards to the first issue, the relationship between the destruction of slavery and the emergence of modern capitalism and imperialism, Du Bois argued that the American Reconstruction period was the historical moment in the development of world system. This was the moment when world capitalism assumed the character that would persist into the 20th century. The abolition of American slavery started the transportation of capital from white to black countries where slavery prevailed, with the same tremendous and awful consequences upon the laboring classes of the world which we see about us today. When raw materials could not be raised in a country like the United States, it could be raised in the tropics of semi-tropic under a dictatorship of industry, commerce, and manufacture, and with no free farming class. The competition of slave of slave-directed agriculture in the Caribbean and South America and Africa and Asia eventually ruined the economic efficiency of agriculture in the United States and in Europe, and participated in modern economic degradation of the white farmer, while it put into the hands of the owners of the machine such a monopoly of raw material that their domination of white labor had more and more complete. According to Du Bois, this was not a necessary development, but one that followed up and dismantling the destruction of the dictatorship of labor established in the southern United States during Reconstruction. There being a rise in America in 1876, a new capitalism, a new enslavement of labor. The world wept because the exploiting group of new world masters, greed and jealousy, became so fierce that they fought for trade and markets and materials and slaves all over the world until at least in 1914. The world flamed in war. The fantastic structure fell, leaving grotesque profits and poverty, plenty and starvation. Empire and democracy started at each other across world depression. But rather than seeing this process as inevitable due to the contradictions between the modes of production and the relations of production, Du Bois argued that it was made possible by the ideologies of racism and, to a lesser extent, individualism. It was these ideologies as historical forces that had precluded the emergence of a powerful labor movement in the United States, a movement whose nucleus would have consisted of 9 million ex-slaves and white peasant workers of the South. The force of these ideologies manifested itself after the war, when these workers did not move to the next local step. The institutionalization of their historical convergence in order to dominate the Reconstruction's, quote, dictatorship of labor. Without this movement, the revolution began in 1855 with John Brown's Kansas raids could not continue. The failure to achieve a consciousness of themselves as a class was not a consequence of the absence of the concentration of production in agriculture, as some Marxists might presume, for in the North, workers had had this experience, yet their labor movement was predominantly trade unionist. On the other hand, in the South, there were the character of production with regards to the concentration of labor was more ambiguous. It was these workers, black and white, who had produced the general strike, decisive in ending civil war. The general strike had not been planned or cautiously organized. Instead, what Du Bois termed a general strike was the total impact on the secessionist South of a series of action circumstantially related to each other. Some 200,000 black workers, most of them slaves, had become part of the Union's military forces. These and an even larger number of black people had withdrawn from productive labor and paramilitary services from the Confederacy, transferring a substantial portion of them to the Union. In addition, tens of thousands of slaves and poor whites had immigrated from the South. The former were escaping slavery, the latter their poverty and the demands and ravages of a war in which they had no vested interest. The result was to critically weaken the secessionists. The ordering of these diverse actions was then a consequence of the social order in which they were reactions. The contradictions within Southern society, rather than a revolutionary vanguard, knit these phenomena into a historical force. After the war, a different order would be required to integrate these phenomena into a political movement, which could be accomplished if only the ruling ideologies of the society were transcended. this was not done, the power of the black vote in the South was certain to go gradually towards reform. It was the countersurgence of the poor whites of all grades feared. It meant to them the reestablishment of that subordination under black labor, which they had suffered during slavery. They, therefore, interposed by violence to increase the natural antagonism between Southerners of the planter class and Northerners of the who represented the military dictatorship as well as capital. The efforts at reform, therefore, at first widely applauded, one by one began to go down before a new philosophy which represented understanding between the planters and poor whites. It was accompanied by eagerness on the part of the poor whites to check the demands of black peoples by any means, and by willingness to do the dirty work of the revolution that was coming. It was blood and crass cruelties. It's bitter words, upheavaled in turmoil. This was the birth and beginning of the KKK, the Triple K. But it was not merely a matter of antagonism of the poor whites against black people being revitalized by the prominence assumed by the latter during the Reconstruction. The deeper economic foundation was these antagonisms, as it was in effect being challenged by proposals of radically altered land tenure put forward by black legislators. Rather, it was the remnant of the Southern ruling class that focused the attention of poor whites onto the black workers. The ruling class had been so weakened by the war that for the first time it was forced to aggressively recruit poor whites as its allies. The master feared their former slaves. They lied about black people. They forestalled the dangers of united Southern labor movement by appealing to the fear and hate of white labor. They encouraged them to ridicule black people and beat them, unalive them, burn their bodies. The planters even gave the poor whites their daughters in marriage.
Okay.
It was
while we're going over this real quick, we also need to keep in mind that what was it that we just read? That this is the first time that poor whites had been turned on black people, but poor whites had been turned on black people way back in the in that revolution when they worked together, and it was a long time that white people were oppressing black people before the end of the Civil War.
That's what I think they're talking about now.
Did the exact opposite.
Okay. But there can be multiple times that this happened too, though. It was in this fashion that the bond between the two elements of the Southern working class failed to materialize. By necessity, Du Bois felt black people fixed class alliances with Northern capitalists and petite bourgeoisie, radical Republicans. Both alliances were by nature short-lived. Once Northern capital had sufficiently penetrated the Southern economic sector so as to dominate its future development, it ceased to depend on black electorates and state legislators responsive to black people and the radical petite bourgeoisie. The alliance ended with the withdrawal of federal troops from the South and the destruction of the government support by the bureaucracy of occupation. By the 1880s, an undercapitalized character of Southern agrarian production was established, and the next for external sources of raw materials more than apparent. In Mexico, the Philippines, Haiti, the Caribbean, Pacific Islands, and elsewhere, Northern capitalists constructed their own forms of slavery, but ones for which they could not easily be held accountable, or among which they would be compelled to live. Turning now to the question of revolutionary consciousness and organization. It is again Du Bois's presentation of the general strike that provides a critique of Marxist thought. I don't know. But first, because general strikes, I don't know. But the first, we should recall just what constitute Marxist theory in America at the time. At the time of Du Bois's writing, A Black Reconstruction, Marxism came in several forms depending on which revolutionary or intellectual tradition one considers. Raphael Samuel has maintained that such, quote, mutations of Marxism, quote unquote, were to be expected, and indeed, one had proceeded by changes in Marx's own writings. In Russian Marxism came, oh my gosh, I have to do the visibly restricted thing again. Too strict. Into the existence of critical trend within populism in Italy in the form of syncretism with positive sociology in Austria and Bulgaria, in tandem with the thought of Lassalle. Second International Marxism was a heterodox affair, with numerous tendencies competing for political attention, and nothing approaching a finished body of doctrine. Marxism was necessarily superimposed and on pre-existing modes of thought, which incorporated rather than displaced, and which were regarded as being intrinsic to a new outlook. The contours changed radically in the period of the Third International, but Marxism, despite its increasingly party-minded character, was very far from being hermetically sealed. In the 1920s, there was a vigorous, indeed furious, philosophical debate within the Soviet Union itself, with rival schools contending on the names of dialectical materialism. Oh my God, you better not say it. Okay, let's find out. And generally, in order of prestige and revolutionary socialism, first were the available works of Marx and Engels and their nearest contemporaries in Europe and Russia. These constitute the classical texts of Marxism. Second, there were the works of the Soviet intelligentsia, Plekhanov, Lenin, Bakunin, Trotsky, and Stalin. From 1917 on, these writers became more significant in the socialist movement, with the bureaucratization of Russian Revolution and the institutionalization of the Comintern. Stalin and his interpretations of Lenin thought ultimately superseding all other Marxist writers and authorities. I do have beef with Stalin, to be honest. All serious theoretical work ceases in the Soviet Union after the collectivization. I don't know about that. Trotsky was driven into exiles in 1929 and assassinated in 1940. Rezanov was stripped of his position in 1931 and died in a labor camp in 1939. Bakunin was silenced in 1929 and shot in 1938. I heard some things why. So he's not even going into the detail of why. That would be helpful. Brezhnev was broken by 1930 and perished in a jail in 1938. Marxism was largely reduced to momentum in Russia as Stalin's rules reached its apogee. Now we have Marxist, Leninist, Maoist movements all over the place. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? It's all over the place. What are you talking about? I guess no one can understand like I'm reading, I guess. In the United States, dichotomies reflecting the conflict of Europe and Russia could be found. But in America, party propagandists were much more prominent than independent theorists. That's because like the presence of theorists in the party had been substantially reduced by the events of the late 1920s and the early 1930s. The expulsion of Trotskyite followed by the Lovestone Right, and the spectacle of the purges of veterans of the Russian Revolution from the Bolshevik Party and compromises of the Popular Front period after 1933 and the protracted dismiss of capitalism had all taken their toll, especially in the revolutionary theory. Marx's emphasis upon the historical inevitability of revolution had diminished importance for party members. What? And left intellectuals alike in the 30s. Communists may have claimed Marxism as their own, but it was merely a ceremony claim. No, it was not, after the Popular Front had been announced. There were, however, few times in CP history when Marxist theory was applied in a serious and sustained analysis of American society, and even non-communist intellectuals made it only infrequent and incomplete stabs at such analysis. Now, since this book has been made, there's been plenty of Marxists that have come out with theories and stuff.
Before the book was made, there were plenty of Marxists that have come out with theories.
Mm-hmm. Revolution had begun regulated to the background, while more pressing met needs, like support for the New Deal, the pursuit of collective security for the Soviet Union. Yep, that's true. That's what an organization of the new unionism represented by the Congress of International Organization, CIO, and the fight for state assistance to the employment of elderly assumed priority. Finally, though Marxism might continue to develop elsewhere within the nexus of communist parties, in Europe, its further elaboration in the 30s seemed to have been confined to Germany, France, and Italy. And even then, as Perry Anderson suggests, the traditions was strained. I'm sorry, I always ask. Oh, page? Oh, no worries. 342. I have some critiques of this, honestly. I don't think this guy's completely correct on the Marxist stuff. Astonishingly, within the entire corpus of Western Marxism, there is not one signal, serious appraisal, or sustained critique of the work of one major theorist by another. Bullshit, revealing close textual knowledge of minimal analytic care in its treatment. At most, there are cursory aspirations or casual condemnations, both equally ill-read and superficial. Not true. Typical examples of this mutual solveness were the few vague remarks directed at Sartre, at Lucas, who is also a Marxist. I don't know about Sartre. I think Sartre is an existentialist, not sure. And the scattering of the anarchist side of Adorn on Sartre. The virulent invective and Coletti against Marcuse, the amateur confusion of Alistair's between Gramsci and Coletti, the peremptory dismissal by Della Volpe of Alistair. Still, such was in disarray. Okay, evidently this was made when? So like, even those regular Marxists that are just learning about Marxists, there's always critiques of other Marxists, and they even critique, never mind. Despite the shared premises that human emancipation was to be identical with the achievements of the socialist revolution, the writing produced by Marxian theorists contains serious disagreements and differences with respect to the historical process of structural elements involved in the emergence of the revolution. Among the areas of contention were questions regarding the nature of class consciousness, the role of a revolutionary party, the political nature of the peasantry and others, pre-capitalist laboring classes, since it is impossible to even summarize the volume of conflicting opinion to be found in Marxist literature. Well, of course, because Marxism is oh my God. And we will concern ourselves with only those aspects in which Du Bois addresses himself. Marx and Engels had argued that the alienation intrinsic to the capitalist mode of production, the contradictions arise between the mode and the social relations accompanied by it, and the extension of appropriations could result in a socialist revolution led by the industrial working class. Though the revolution itself was not inevitable, that would have amounted to economic determinism. The role of this specific kind of worker in such a revolution is certain. Hold on a second. Yeah, on his take of history, I would say. The historical dialectics identified the industrial workers, the proletariat, as a negation of capitalist society, the force produced by capitalism that could finally destroy it. Capitalism pitted one class, the bourgeoisie, against another, the proletariat. This was the specific character of the class struggle in capitalist societies. However, since there were more than two classes, they don't understand, in all the 19th century society that Marx and Engels studied, it became necessary for them to identify and assign to these other classes particular historical roles, because that's the point. The petite bourgeoisie were both nominally and historically the middlemen of capitalism, its managers, technicians, small merchants, and shopkeepers. Unlike the bourgeoisie, the petite bourgeoisie did not own or control the means of production. Still, it was a class whose members recognized their independency on the bourgeoisie for social privileges. Their political loyalties were to the bourgeoisie, and as such, they were understood to be reactionary by their class nature. A fourth class, a lumpenproletariat, too, was reactionary. The class was characterized as one of the fed off the proletariat and the parasitic manner. The lumpenproletariat were the thieves, the thugs, the prostitutes, people without the definite occupation and the stable domicile, end quote. It was from this class that the society recruited many of those who would form its cohesive instruments: the army, the state militia, the police. The fifth class was the peasantry, which we don't have peasantry here. And the lumpenproletariat has been advanced, in my opinion, by Mao, Fanon, and also by Fred Hampton. This was a class that came closest to the poor whites and black workers of the antebellum period in terms of its systematic relationship to industrial capitalism, its social organization, and its historical origins. For Marx and Engels, the peasantry was a remnant of a pre-capitalist society. What? No. The peasantry was a remnant of feudal relate. I don't know if I read that wrong. But unlike other residues of
You didn't read it wrong.
There we go. What?
I said you didn't read it wrong. It was that bad.
Yeah. But unlike these residues of feudalism, for example, the clergy, the aristocracy, the artists and craftsmen, the peasantry continued to be of importance in capitalist societies. Both the peasantry and the bourgeoisie had been negations of feudalism. However, the peasantry's narrow-minded, quote-unquote, self-interest had been intended to destroy feudalist relations by moving historically backward to small individual land holdings and away from the inclusive national integrated economic structures for which the bourgeoisie aspired. In feudalism, there was no bourgeoisie in feudalism. Maybe. The bourgeoisie had been a historically negation. Okay, sure. With the destruction of feudalism by the capitalist forces, the peasantry became reactionary in a different way. The peasantry was now a potential ally of the bourgeoisie, sure, yes, to poise against political forces of industrial labor and the socialist revolution. Lenin and Trotsky came from Tsarist Russia, a society dominated by a peasant subsistence or backward economy, saw the peasantry differently from Marx or Engels. That's why material conditions and things like this and theories get advanced. In the central and western Russia countryside at the end of the 19th century, the remnants of Russian feudalism were to be found in the aristocracy and the poor peasantry. What does Marx say about the birthmarks of things, the essence of things still remaining in the current mode of production, that there's essence of these things?
Yes.
So yeah, there were the kulaks, were the rich peasants, because Lenin did a class analysis of the peasants, consisted of rural bourgeoisie supported by capitalist agriculture, and in the middle peasantry, essentially locked into a manifold forms of subsistence agriculture. The roving peasantry, the rural proletariat, according to Lenin, emerged from poor peasants who worked either for the kulaks, landlords, or some exceptional middle peasants. Both Lenin and Trotsky agree that the rural relations of production were subject to internal antagonisms of class struggle, kulaks versus poor peasants, and, most importantly, that the peasantry could be an ally to the working class movement, of course. In 1901, for example, Lenin had observed, our rural laborers are still so closely connected with the peasantry that they are still too heavily burdened with the misfortunes of the peasantry generally to enable the movement of rural workers to assume national significance, either now or in the immediate future. The whole essence of our agrarian program is that the rural proletariat must fight together with the rich peasantry to abolish the remnants of serfdom for the cut-off lands. But in 1905, after several years of recurring peasant uprisings, his view of the rural proletariat was more sanguine. Quote, we must explain to it that its interests are antagonistic to those of the bourgeois peasantry. We must call upon it to fight for socialist revolution. Though Trotsky and Lenin were opposed to the Black Partition, Marx terms for extra legal seizures and breaking up of land into small individual holdings. They saw it as a tactic of momentarily attracting the peasantry to the side of the revolution. Once the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then Lenin said the dictatorship of the proletariat with an alliance with the peasantry. So Lenin did say that in his works. I read that, as was secured. Other arrangements could be made for the peasants. Part of the reason for the judgment made by Marx and Engels of the peasantry had to do with the conditions of work that circumscribed peasant production and the social relations that fixed the peasants into prescribed links of exchange. Then if you think the peasantry exists, then name the peasantry class in the United States. Because peasantry, what's the definition of a peasantry? Of a peasant in feudal relations? Think about that, just real quick. Marx saw the peasantry as a vast mass consisting of functional clones, simple cultivators, proximate but without significant intercourse, lacking in all but the most rudimentary political organizations or consciousness. Engels, too, was impressed by the great space that peasants occupied and subscribed to them a tradition of submissiveness and loyalty to particular masters. Neither suggested that the peasantry was capable of independent political action. I don't know, I haven't read if Marx and Engels actually said that. I will read more. And if we compare the descriptions found in Marx and Engels of peasant life with those of Du Bois concerning the slaves and poor whites, we would discover striking and important similarities of the slave workers. Du Bois commented, before the war, the slave was curiously isolated. This was the policy and the effective policy of the slave system, which made the plantation the center of a black group with a network of white folks around and about who kept the slaves from contact with each other. Of course, clandestine contact there always was, the passing of black people to and fro on errands, particularly the semi-freedom and mingling of cities, and yet the mass of slaves were curiously provincial. Yea, and kept out the currents of information. Oh, you're asking for clarifications? I'm sorry. I thought you said that you thought there was still one. I'm sorry. I read that wrong. I'm not trying to be mean. In the master domiciles, the complexity of the relationship between labor and the exploiters of labor many times include bonds of sediment. Yeah, but they still are in a capitalist framework. They still do capitalist relations. I don't think they're peasantry. Peasantry has a significant historical character, being tied to the land, being tied to like landlordship. The landlords would be more of a significance of the essence of feudalism still remaining in a capitalist way, because essence and birthmarks of other past mode of productions exist somewhat in the new mode of production. So I don't know. We'll have to look at that further, because I think when one of the groups I'm with, we talked about that, and we couldn't find out anything that was peasantry here in the United States because of that definition and its class relations during feudalism. Okay, well, I'm gonna have to talk about that. The masters, wait. The masters had stood between them in a world in which they had no legal protection except the master, and that the masters were their source of information. Earlier in the work, Du Bois had suggested any mass movement under such circumstances must materialize slowly and painfully, and the poor white worker ignored, as he believed, by the American labor movement, the abolitionists, northern capitalists, and southern planters. Du Bois reckoned similarly pessimistic judgments could be made. He reiterated Franciscus Simpkins and Robert Woody Bleak description of their conditions. The wretched log, hut, or two are the only inhabitations in sight. Here resides, or rather takes shelter, the miserable cultivator of the ground, or a still more destitute class who make a precarious living by peddling light wood in the city. These cabins are dens and filth. Their faces are, oh my gosh, bedabbed with the muddy accumulation of weeks. The poor wretches seem startled when you address them and start your question, cowering like culprits. Du Bois added that the poor whites were also bound to the master class. Indeed, the neutral leaders of the poor whites, the smaller farmers, the merchant and professional man, the white mechanics, the slave overseers, were bound to the planters and repelled from the slaves. The only heaven that attracted them was the life of the great southern planters. Yet, in the midst of the Civil War, it was these two peoples, the black and the white workers, who had mounted the rebellions, the general strike, quote unquote, which had turned turned loose the revolutionary dynamics that Du Bois would describe as quote, the most extraordinary experiments of Marxism that the world before the Russian Revolution had seen. 100,000 poor whites had deserted the Confederate armies, and perhaps a 500 million black workers had abandoned the plantations. It was the same pattern, indeed, that would come to fruition with Russia, like the American slaves and the poor whites. And amidst the war, the Russian peasantry would desert their armies in the field. Their rebellion, too, marked the beginning of a revolution. Like most informed men and women of this time, Du Bois was deeply impressed by the Russian Revolution, and he believed that he could write and speak of it without having to dogmatize with Marx and Lenin. He had referred to what he considered a significant element of the revolution as early as 1917, when he criticized the American Socialist Party's ideologies for praising the success of the Russian peasantry while ignoring the achievements of American black people. Yeah, we'll have to do an analysis on that. It's worth doing analysis on it. Revolution. Let's see here. We're good. I'm going to find out. No, let's go to the next one. Revolution was discussed, but it was the successful revolution of white folk and not the unsuccessful revolution of black soldiers in Texas. You do not stop to consider whether the Russian peasants had any more to endure than the black soldiers of the 24th Infantry. The processes of the Russian Revolution were a framework up for his interpretation of Reconstruction because it, too, had begun among the agrarian peasant people. It was a characteristic shared by all the revolutions that Du Bois linked in significance to the American Civil War and its Reconstruction, that is, France, Spain, India, and China. In addition, since before his visit to the Soviet Union in 1926, why are you giving? No, I don't want you. He had been cautious about the nature of class consciousness among the workers in Russia, the United States, and elsewhere. In 1927, when he had returned from the Soviet Union, he had written, "Does this mean that Russia has, quote, put over her new psychology? Not by any means. She has tried and tried hard. She is trying and trying hard. But there are plenty of people in Russia who still hate and despise the working man's blouses and the peasant's straw shoes. And plenty of workers who regret the passing of the freehand Russian nobility, who miss and splendid pageantry of the czars, and who cling doggedly to religious dogma and superstition. In spite of, here we go. Not too long, my friend, not too long. In spite of his note to the 10th chapter of Reconstruction, which explains why he was not using his original title for the chapter, The Dictatorship of the Black Proletariat in South Carolina. Du Bois knew the Russian Revolution was a dictatorship of the proletariat that was less democratic and less dependent upon conscious actions of the workers than was to be found in the post-Civil War period of America. As Russia, working men is today neither skilled nor intelligent to any such extent as his responsibilities demand, there is within his rank the Communist Party directing the proletariat towards their full future dictatorship. This is nothing new. And in 1938, Du Bois would declare, when the realities of the situation were posed to men, to radical solutions were suddenly resorted to Russian communism and fascism. What? They both did away with democracy and substituted oligarchic control of government and industry, of thought and action. Communism aimed at eventual democracy and even elimination of the state, but sought this by a dogmatic program laid down 90 years ago by a great thinker, but largely invalidated by nearly a century of extraordinary social change. Like Lenin, but for different reasons and in a different way, Du Bois had realized that Marx had not anticipated historical transformations of capitalism. Yes, he did, especially in the complicated phenomenon of imperialism. He did see that, and cautious as well as was required in the application of Marx to the institutions of American black people. That's why it's important that Marx's thing got continued by Lenin by the addressing the imperialist nature. Like, hello. It was a great loss to American black people that the great mind of Marx and his extraordinary insight into industrial conditions could not have been brought to bear at first hand upon the history of American black people between 1876 and the World War. Whatever he said and did concerning the uplift of the working class must therefore be modified so far as black people are concerned by the fact that he had not studied at first hand their peculiar race problem here in America. I can see that there can be some, This left a monumental, thank you, a monumental gap in the analysis of capitalism and its development, assigning Marx's own work to a specific historical period. Now, Marx, if you read, Marx does talk about the colonial institutions in America, but briefly. I don't know. That's only in volume 1. He does talk about it. Du Bois could conclude while working on Black Reconstruction that, quote, we can only say, as it seems to me, that the Marxian philosophy is a true diagnosis of the situation in Europe in the middle of the 19th century, despite some of its logical difficulties. Oh my gosh. This is where he's saying that Marxism is not a universal concept when it is. You can have an analysis and utilize. That's why Black communists in the global South, which I call the global majority, was able to utilize Marxism methodology to analyze the conditions and how the social relations are interacting with each other. Are we really? I'm sorry, I disagree at this point. In American Marxism, Lenin had largely replaced Marx as a definitive revolutionary thinker. No, he did not. By the early 1920s, where Marx was anticipated and dependent upon the rise of class consciousness, Lenin was posited the party in its stead. For Lenin, the party, a small group of trained, disciplined, and professional revolutionists, constituted a necessary first stage in the development of the dictatorship of the proletariat. All right, real quick. Yeah, right? It is pretty harsh. It is pretty harsh. I think that, like, sometimes in our analysis of Marx's progression, we fail to mention how, like, some of these things that Lenin recognized was advanced by Lenin through the methodology of analysis of Marxian analysis of the world. So, yeah. 349. Hold on a second. Let's see here. 349. Can people remind me of 349? Holy crap. Okay. 49, 50, 51, 54. We have to go a little bit over 349. I said 349, right? You could bring up Doodly if you want. Hold on, where are we at? There we go. All right, let's bring Doodly up. Okay, cool. Hold on a second. The party would deliberately and scientifically create the conditions for the evolution of worker consciousness and for socialism, where Marx had presumed that a bourgeois society established by the bourgeois revolution was a necessary condition for the evolution of conscious socialist movement. Lenin, in April 1917, as I did it backward, declared that the process had been completed in Russia less than 3 months. Du Bois had been skeptical of Marx and Lenin on both scores. I don't know. We'll find out. In Black Reconstruction, he reviewed the events of the American postbellum with a Hegelian sense on the cunning reasons. The slaves freed themselves, Du Bois thought, not by way of an objective consciousness of their conditions, but rather by the dialectics of religious myths. The mass of slaves, even more intelligent ones, the great group of field hands, were in religious and historical fervor. This was the coming of the Lord. This was the fulfillment of prophecy, the legend, and it was a golden dawn after chain of 1,000 years. It was everything miraculous and perfect and promising. And the other figures in the drama of emancipation, from Lincoln down to the poor whites, were just as much overtaken by the unintended consequences of their action. Lincoln had never been an abolitionist. He had never believed in full black citizenship. He had never desperately to win the war without black soldiers. And he had emancipated the slaves only on the account of military necessity. Freedom from slave was the logical result of a wild attempt to wage war in the midst of 4 million black slaves, and while sublimely to ignore the interests of those slaves in the outcome of the fighting. Leaders then led in increments. The northern field officers who put the fugitive slaves to work did not intend to free them, but they did. The Confederacy moved to preserve slavery, to help to end it. It helped to end it. Sorry. Groups moved to the logic of immediate self-interest and historical paradox. Consciousness, then it did develop, had come later in the process of the events. The revolution had caused the formation of revolutionary consciousness and had not been caused by it. The revolution was spontaneous. To the second point, the preconditions of bourgeois society, Du Bois maintained that no bourgeois society was the setting of this revolution. The dominant ideology of the society was that of the plutocracy, a dictatorship of labor. Yeah, thank you. A dictatorship of labor and land without democratic pretensions. But of more significance, the ideology of the plutocracy.
Plantocracy.
I got it. I said it again. I repeated it. Had not been the ideology of the slaves. The slaves had produced their own culture, their own consciousness by adapting the forms of the non-black society to the conceptualization derived from their own historical roots and social conditions. In some instances, indeed, elements produced by the slave culture had become the dominant ones in white Southern culture. The process had spanned generations. The rolling period of Hebrew prophecy and biblical legends furnished inaccurate but splendid words. The subtitle Folklore of Africa, with whimsy and parable, veil wishes and wisdom, and above all fell the anointed charisma of the slave music, of the slave music, an only gift of pure art in America. This was a human experience from which the rebellion rose. Torn from it were the principles of, quote, right and wrong, vengeance and love, beauty, sweet beauty and truth, that would serve as a guidepost to the ex-slaves. It was the tradition critical to the framing of the survival of these new people. Du Bois, despite all the diversions and distractions of intellect's social origins and ambition that had marked his even then long life, had at last come to the black radical tradition. He never stopped being a Marxist, though. He tried to combine it here. In the midst of the most fearsome maelstrom his age had seen, and with the pitiable reaction of the declared revolutionary position in mind, his purposeful interrogation of the past had led him to the hidden specter of black revolutionists. Their revolution had failed, of course, and with its failure had gone the second and truer possibility of a American democracy. But until the writing of Black Reconstruction, and the only mark on American historical consciousness left by their movement had been a revised legend of their S-wordry. Du Bois had understood finally that this was insufficient. Somebody in each era he had written must make clear the facts with the declaration. The first ledger of radical black historiography had been filled. In Black Reconstruction, Du Bois had striven to enrich the critique of capitalism and bourgeoisie society that had emerged into the dominant strains of Western radicalism. He had no choice if he was to comprehend the crises of war and depression that devastated the world system in his lifetime and the rebellion of revolution in Asia, Europe, America, Africa, and the New World, that there were concomitants. Du Bois came to believe that the preservation of the capitalist world system its very expansion in the 19th and 20th century had involved the absorption of new sources of labor power, not by their conversion into wage labor, but by coercion. Characteristically, capitalist imperialism had magnified the capacity for capital accumulation by force by force, variously disguised as a state nationalism, benevolent colonialism, race destiny, or the civilized mission. Except in scattering instances, the peasantry of the developing world had become neither urban nor rural proletariats, but near slaves. For most, their social development had been effectively arrested. The result, hold on. Sure, whatever. Just go away. The result relative to their own recent past and the situations of European workers was slowing down. Indeed, whole populations had been limited either during the pacification or through forced labor. The belief that capitalism would advance African and Asian and other peasantries had for the most part proved to be misplaced. Beyond Western Europe, the capitalist world system had produced social and economic chaos. No theory of history that conceptualized capitalism as a progressive historical force qualitatively increased their mastery of human beings over the material base of their existence was adequate to the task of making the experience of the modern world comprehensible. For Du Bois, America in the first half of the 19th century, a society in which manufactured and industrial capitalism had been married to slave production, had been the microcosm of the world system. The advanced sector of the world economy could expand just so long as they could dominate and rationalize by brute force and exploitation of essentially non-industrial and agrarian labor. The expansion of American slavery in the 19th century was not an anachronism, but a forewarning. But so too, he believed, was its defeat. It is also true, as Marx and Engels and others had anticipated, that there were contradictions to the world economy and the system of coercion upon which it depended. However, Du Bois came to perceive that they were not limited to the contradictions concerning the radical Western intelligentsia. In the long run, that is, by the beginning of the 20th century, the vision, almost done everybody, the division of destruction of bourgeoisie society entertained by Western socialists had been shown to be the only partial relevance. The working classes of Europe and America had indeed mounted militant assaults on the ruling classes, but in defeat they had also displayed their vulnerabilities to bourgeoisie nationalism and racialist sentiments. Elsewhere, other realities had to come to the fore. The shocks of Western imperialism, which in the previous centuries had appeared to European radicals to be at the margins of the world revolution, whereby the 1930s occupying center stage. The indigenous mutiny of the Boxer Rebellion, that's actually India, sorry. The nationalist struggle that had erupted in Sudan, Algeria, Morocco, Somalia, Abyssinia, West and Southern Africa, and carried over into the 20th century. The People's War had achieved major historical significance in the revolution in Mexico, China, and Russia. And in every instance, peasants and agrarian workers had been the primary social basis of rebellion and revolution. Now, nowhere, not even in Russia, where the rebellious urban proletariat was a fraction of the mobilized working class, had a bourgeois social order formed in a precondition for revolutionary struggle. Revolutionary consciousness has formed in the process of anti-imperialist and nationalist struggles, and the beginnings of resistance had often been initiated by ideological constructions remote from the proletarian consciousness that was presumed of Marxist theory of revolution. The idiom of revolutionary consciousness had been historical and cultural rather than the mirror of production. The opposition that had struck most deeply at capitalist domination and imperialism had been those formed outside the logic of bourgeois hegemony. What? In Black Reconstruction, Du Bois had tried to give these processes a concrete historical appearance. Again, he had very little choice in the matter. The ideology of the black struggle, the revolutionary consciousness of the slaves, had appeared in his westernized eye. Part legend, part whimsy, part art. Yet he realized it had been sufficient to arouse them into mass resistance and had provided them with a vision of the world they prefer. Their collective actions had achieved the force of historical analogic to racism, slavery, and capitalism. And that's where we'll stop. Chapter 10. 353. We're going to do Sailor James and the Black Radical Tradition. Now, I know Sailor James still is a Marxist. He's a communizer. He's a Marxist. And and what I've read about him, he tried to bring the Marxist dialectics and the Black Radical traditions and combine them together. That's what he tried to do. He recognized it. Jesus. All right. What's up? Who wants to go first? Speak. Speak us.
I think Joe should go first.
Joe, would you like to say anything before we move on to Dooley?
Not really. I kind of got in a bad mood at one point. The baby's sleeping though, so don't come rushing in here.
What you getting in a bad mood about? Me? Okay.
Okay. So, okay, first off, his take on, like, fucking dogs. Sorry, his take on, history not being a science completely contradicts the fact that he quite literally uses historicism. And when he brought up historicism when mentioning another black radical, he didn't mention what type of historicism that person used. Which, like, what? Like, how are you, like, quote unquote critiquing the specific type of historicism that you are, being historical materialism, and you don't mention that the guy you brought up used that specific type of historicism when you're mentioning his historicism? Like, that was
materialism now throughout this whole book. You know?
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
He's doing historical materialism through this whole book. So, like, that's a contradiction inside of his reading, because he's displaying it without saying it, and he's just avoiding the word. You know what I mean? And to put, like, Du Bois and, like, all these other people, like Sailor James, as non-Marxist because they chose the Black Radical tradition, well, that's also a false thing. That is also false, too.
And also, like, people can be multiple things. Like, the essentialization inside of, like, the more academic stuff kind of just, like, makes all forms of thought dogmatic. And, but, yeah, other than that, when it came to, any conclusion that he did make that was correct, it didn't feel like it was correct because of some method he had of analyzing. It just seemed like he was correct because he was just kind of lucky enough to stumble into a correct analysis.
Thing too is the whole dismissal of people's development and understanding the objective world is a developing thing. Like Marx started out as a left Hegelianist, and he moved on, and he kept going and going, and there's some critiques of him, but there's also misplacements of things too, like with Lenin and stuff like that. I'm not great manning, it's just what it is. Like Lenin is the perpetual motion of Marxist theory into the stage of development of capitalism, right? Of going to a higher development, right? Marx was seeing the beginnings of those things and everything. In fact, he went out, and I keep saying this, to Africa to engage with the colonial situation. He just didn't have enough time to complete his analysis of that, because he was out there trying to put his book together. But then he had to engage, because as Marxists, we do engage with the reality and with things, so that way we can have a correct analysis and a correct investigation of what we're being affected by. You know what I mean? So like it's just like putting critiques. We're like not having critiques, but not establishing a development process of a newer understanding of knowledge. You know? That's the little bit of concern I have. But other than that, the history is good. I like the history that he talks about, you know?
Yeah.
Anybody else have anything? Go ahead.
I'm not saying this book is bad. I'm saying it needs to be looked at with a critical eye.
Yes.
Because,
that's the point.
Yeah. And I think that there is an issue that we deal with when it comes to people who claim to be Marxists, but they stop with the communist theory. They stop with the specifically like Marx or Lenin or Stalin. They don't read past anything that is the essentials, and they expect to have the best worldview. So I do think that that is an issue.
Yeah. We should be reading everything and having an analysis of it, and formulating those analyses to see if they actually are congruent with what we're seeing. You know what I mean? That's the important part. Angela Davis. It's because she does. I don't know that. But yeah, I saw that. But I don't care, because, like, if you're going to dictate that I'm a certain way just because I'm reading a book like this, then you're not having a full, complete analysis of what I'm doing and how I'm, like, doing all these things. So, like, I don't know. People don't, like, they'll say stuff instead of, like, coming up and talking about it and seeing what's going on. And, like, why are you reading this book? What's the point? You know what I mean? They just have their assumptions, and they stick with their assumptions. That's the problem. So people don't talk to each other anymore. You know, they just have assumptions instead of talking. But oh well. Anyways, is there anything else before I close it out? Oh, like someone's saying something to you.
A little off topic, but can you speak? Sure. Bacon's Rebellion was a rebellion done by Irish people and black people, but during that rebellion, Irish people were being given whiteness, so Irish people kind of stabbed black people in the back. What happened in America.
Yeah. All right, then. Well, if no, I'll wait till they respond, actually. That's supposed to be that's fair. I forgot the S. Hey, Joe, can you meet me in the kitchen?
My point.
Oh, good.
That was kind of my point when I was making it earlier, was the fact that we did stab them in the back so quickly, and that we had been dominating over black people, poor white people. By we, I mean poor white people. Hello, I'm poor, I'm white. We had been using that whiteness as a privilege to dominate over black people from that
Yeah,
time.
no one's denying that part. That is definitely the case. And so many times have black people and poor white people have been put in the position to actually, hold on a second, to actually come together and actually get rid of the systems. And every time they do that, you're right, white people betray them because the ruling class gives them their status quo and power to whiteness. Yeah, that I agree with. There's been multiple times too that it's happened, and I agree with that too. I don't know if Bacon's rebellion was rich landowners. I think so.
I don't know if Bacon was the rich landowner or the slave. I can't remember the name of. I just know it's called Bacon's Rebellion, but I do know
Mhm.
that it was slaves and poor white people rising up together, and then white people immediately turning on them.
Yeah. I don't know. I just know like a little bit about Bacon's Rebellion. There's a good excerpt you can get it from Black AF history that goes with a little bit of it. You can get into there. You can look up an excerpt of Black AF history and